Ok. Bonsoir et bienvenue à la deuxième édition de Arts and Re-storations from Africa to the World. Cet événement est co-organisé par le Princeton University Art Museum, the Center for Digital Humanities de Princeton et l'Africa World Initiative.
This event is co-organized by the Princeton University and Museum, the Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton and the Africa World Initiative. Some practical information before you get started. This event will include audio interpretation as well as real-time subtitling in English. To listen to this panel in French in its English version, or click on the icon globe into the Zoom toolbar and select your preferred audio language. To access live subtitles in either language, open a separate browser. Go to the link that we will share in the chat. If you have questions for our technical support team, you can ask them via the chat function that you will find in the bar tools at the bottom of your screen. Our technical team will monitor questions and do their best to assist you. If you have questions for the presenters, thank you for using the question and answer function, also located at the bottom of your screen, on your screen. We will monitor your questions and answer them at the end of the program. The Art and Recreation from Africa is to the World program is an initiative established during the academic year 2023-2024. This series was designed to encourage open dialogue, inclusive and interdisciplinary on African arts and traditions. The first edition explored a wide range of themes, in particular the place of African arts, the heritage of French-speaking African arts, the recontextualization of African art and global museum culture, zoomorphism and anthropomorphism in African arts. The debate on the return of works from an African point of view as well as material cultures, intangible memory, and the role of African arts in creative industries, building on the success of the first edition. This second series of seminars aims to continue this essential conversation while broadening our understanding of the arts and African traditions, as well as their global and innovative potential. This new edition aims to deepen the exploration of these themes and to highlights the impact and perspectives of African arts on the global stage. And this restoration and community panel looks at the impact of community contributions and collaboration on the development of inclusive musical practices and ethics as a cornerstone of artistic production. And so we have for this second panel 3 participants. Professor Hugues Medjana, a key figure in the field of museology and the management of cultural heritage in Africa, holder of a doctorate in cultural heritage management and museology. He is a doctor and he is director of the National Museum, from Cameroon to Yaoundé. At the same time, he works as a teacher-researcher at the University of Marua and at the University from Eboloa in Cameroon, sharing its expertise with students and researchers in these institutions. Dr. Tiana is the author of numerous scientific publications dealing with challenges for museums in Africa and more particularly in Cameroon. In his work, it explores crucial themes such as museum management, the Africanization of these institutions as well as the return of cultural objects illicitly exported to abroad. His book devoted to the National Museum of Cameroon proposes an innovative reflection where he sees the museum not only as a place for exhibiting objects, but above all as an essential instrument for national cohesion. He insists on the need for the museum to go beyond simple presentation objects by taking a proactive approach to reach various audiences and justify its existence in a context of dependence on public funding. Our second panelist, Doctor after Teacher, Hugues Chana Human Doc, will be Dr. Professor Dauda Keita, an eminent personality in the field of archaeology and prehistory in Mali, currently Director General of the National Museum of Mali in Bamako. He is committed to defending and promoting Mali's cultural heritage through various initiatives. Holder of a Master in Arts and Archaeology obtained at the University State Diploma of Leningrad in 1991 and a doctorate in prehistory from the University of Paris-West Nanterre. Professor Keita has devoted his career to the study of the historical and social dynamics of region. In his book The Settlement of the Eastern March of the Inner Niger Delta in the First Millennium after Jesus Christ, he explores settlement mechanisms through the analysis of macro traces identified on the archaeological ceramics connecting the subregions of the Inner Niger Delta, Gourma, of the mountains and the Dogon country, professor at the University of Social Sciences and Management in Bamako. He was responsible for numerous archaeological investigations and directed several projects dealing with endangered cultural sites. As the initiator of the cultural project, he co-founded village museums across Mali, thus providing communities with economic and educational opportunities. These initiatives aim to combat the looting of archaeological sites and the trafficking of objects, cultural, while developing a sense of community ownership of heritage. Our last and third panelist will be Mr. Hervé Yumbi EU, who is one of the most acclaimed and internationally known Cameroonian artists, a graduate of the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He has distinguished himself by his ability to combine traditional and modern techniques while integrating elements of its cultural heritage. Hervé Yumbi is known for his artistic practice that focuses on the research and criticism of conventions and standards, acquired, often considered to be rigid rules or norms in the art world. Through his works, it challenges these established paradigms, inviting deep reflection on authenticity and cultural identity, and the power dynamics that shape the perception of contemporary African art. This is what regularly brings him to Gracefields to participate in ceremonies and collaborate with artisans, locals. A striking example of this approach is the series Faces of the Masks. In this series, he integrates forms of masks that move away from Western stereotypes of African art into Bamalik ritual performances. By making these foreign forms authentic in the Bamalik context, it challenges the dichotomy between traditional and contemporary art. These works are steeped in symbolism, question the historical narratives and socio-political dynamics of Africa while celebrating the richness and diversity of African cultures. Yumbi uses a variety of materials and forms of artistic expression, ranging from painting to sculpture in order to create powerful and engaging visual dialogues. As a committed artist, Hervé Yumbi also participates in community and collaborative projects that aim to strengthen the visibility and appreciation of African art on the international scene. In this case, he is one of the founding members of the Kapsiki Circle, a group of Cameroonian artists established in 1998 aimed at enriching artistic education through networks of artists and exhibitions. His work has been exhibited in numerous galleries and major artistic events around the world, thus confirming his place as one of the major contemporary artists of the African continent. And our moderator will be Rodrigue Nzalakuli, gameplay, holder of a Master II in Social Communication from the Catholic University of Congo, specialized in bibliology sciences of writing and written communication and of a Master II in Development specializing in tourism and cultural heritage from Senghor University in Alexandria. He is an alumnus of the National School of Administration of the Democratic Republic of Congo since April 2023. He is preparing a doctoral thesis at the Department of Historical Sciences and Heritage and Development Management at the University of Kinshasa. In parallel with his research, Mr. Zili Kali is head of the Culture Division at the National Commission of the Republic, Democratic Congo for UNESCO, in Kinshasa and is pursuing a Master II in Digital Humanities at the University of Franche-Comté in France. He is joining us today as the moderator of this session and I'm giving the floor now to our first panelist, who will be a professor, Human, Tiana. Thank you for joining us and good luck. Good exchange. Good morning, everyone. Okay, I don't know if you listen to me. I am Hughes, the director of the National Museum of Cameroon. Thank you to the Princeton Museum for joining me in this important activity, which focuses on reconnecting the arts with communities. My presentation on this issue of the theorization of museums and that of theorization of museums, communities in Africa. This presentation will focus on next. Next, this presentation will be given in 4 parts. I am trying to talk about dynamic theories and contemporary museology. The second part will focus on the construction of the collections and the staging. The third part will focus on the acquisition of objects of the court and about secrets. The fourth part will focus on the conservation of collections, financing, part 5 and the conclusion. Next.
Je
I
dirais
would
en
say as an
introduction
introduction.
d'agir
Next,
pour et dans le milieu de vie naturelle évitable pour les populations. Pourquoi? Parce que
I would say in the
les dynamiques
introduction because I,
positives et constructives des habitants
for and in the natural and
d'une
vital living
localité
environment for
sont
populations.
équivalentes aux abeilles
Why?
qui
Because
butinent
the
dans le
positive and
verger
constructive
et
dynamics of
sans
the
elles,
inhabitants
il ne pourrait y avoir de fruits.
of a
Nous n'insiste
locality are
pas, la
equivalent to the
création de
bees
musées
that
n'est pas
gather in
seulement
the
conditionnée par
orchard,
les
and
facteurs
without
techniques,
them, there is
matériels,
there could be no
économiques.
fruit, so to speak.
Elle est aussi liée
The
au
creation
contexte
of museums is not only conditioned by technical,
socio-culturel.
material,
Et si on peut revenir
human,
au Cameroun,
economic.
par exemple, au Cameroun, il y
It
a
is
deux
also
grandes
linked to
catégories de
social
musées.
contexts,
Les musées
cultural.
publics, c'est-à-dire
And
les
if we
musées
can
de
go back
l'œuvre
to
d'art,
Cameroon, for example, in
les
Cameroon,
publics
there are 3-4 main categories of museums,
du
public
domaine
museums,
public.
that is to
Les
say,
musées privés, c'est l'œuvre
museums that
privée. Et les
belong to the
musées
public of
communautaires,
the,
ce sont beaucoup plus les musées
from the
privés, mais
public
qui
domain.
relèvent des chefferies.
Private
Les musées
museums that
installés dans les
fall under the
chefferies.
private
Et
sector
dès
and
lors,
community
une pensée se
museums.
forge.
It's much more private museums, but which
C'est de
fall
l'ordre
under the
et question de
chiefdoms.
ces musées,
The
leur
museum
caractéristique et
located
leur
in the
rapport à
chiefdoms,
l'homme
and
et à
from then on,
l'environnement. Je
a
parlais
thought
ici
is
beaucoup plus
formed,
des musées communautaires. Ces expériences
is
nouvelles,
developing in
centrées
questions about these museums,
sur
their place in
la
society, their
participation
relationship to man and the
communautaire
environment.
transforment telle
I was
qu'elle va
talking
au
more
niveau de
about
gestion du
community
patrimoine.
museums here.
Quelle est la
These new
place
experiences,
et l'enjeu de la
focused
gestion
on community
communautaire des musées?
participation, are truly
Next.
transforming the way wealth management is
Voilà
managed.
pourquoi j'ai essayé dans une seconde
What is the
partie
place and the challenge
parler
of
de la
community management
des
of
théories dynamiques
museums?
contemporaines.
Next.
Et dans cette partie, on se pose véritablement des questions
That's
de la
why I tried to
muséologie de
talk about the
rupture,
theory of
la
theories in the
muséologie
second
critique,
part,
de la
contemporary
muséologie des musées, de la
dynamics. And
muséologie
in
des
this
nouvelles
part,
muséologies,
we are
la
really
question
asking
du
ourselves
muséologue au
questions about
centre des musées.
museology, about Jacques Haynard's
La
breakthroughs,
musée,
of museology critical of museology, of the idea of
la
museology,
théorie
of the new
vivante.
biology, the issue of
Les musées
museum
sont les lieux
development
de
at the
mort,
center of
c'est-à-dire les choses
museums,
qui n'ont pas
the,
de place
and in
repos.
theory,
Mais cette
as they
théorie est
say,
battue en brèche
museums are places of
dans
death.
les musées
That is to say,
communautaires.
things have no
On dit la
useful
plupart des musées en
space.
Afrique parce que les objets ici gagnent leur valeur
But
d'usage.
this theory is being challenged in
Ce qu'on
community
essaie de trouver en
museums
parlant
and
de
even most museums in
la
Africa,
muséologie
because
de
objects
contexte.
keep their value in use. Where do we come
Pourquoi
from?
parler de muséologie de contexte?
We tried to theorize by
Parce
talking
que
about museology,
ces objets,
contexts.
en
Why
mettant
talk about
l'accent
museology, context? Because these
pourquoi?
objects with
L'homme constate
emphasis.
qu'en mettant l'accent sur certains types d'objets, on a mis de côté
Why do
tout
we
ou
see
bon,
that by
ou en
putting
franche partie
the
des
emphasis on
collections en Afrique?
creation,
Les collections
on
constituées
certain
de
types of
parcours théoriques
objects?
ont été déracinées de leur contexte, de
A
leur valeur
large part of the
d'usage et de
collections in
l'équipe
Africa
documentation
has been put
nécessaire à leur
aside. The
compréhension.
collections
Ces
made
pièces
up,
demeurent à
sometimes
jamais muettes.
heterogeneous, have been
Et
uprooted
même
from
si
their
aujourd'hui,
context, of their use value,
elles
deprived
entrent
of
en
any
silence
documentation
de nos musées en
necessary for
Afrique,
their
et même de
understanding.
plusieurs musées
These
en
rooms
Afrique.
all remain silent forever. And even though today,
Elles n'entrent pas,
they
elles
have the
gardent leur
walls of our
énigme.
museums in
Rien n'est
Africa
sauvé
and
plus ou
even of
moins,
several
mais la
museums in
culture
the
d'histoire
West.
demeure muette.
They don't come in. They keep their
Ce qui fait
enigma.
donc que
Art is more or less
la collecte
saved.
des objets exposés dans les
But
musées
culture
communautaires ou
and
affichés
history
dans nos
remain silent.
gestion programmée. Elle ouvre une chaîne de préservation de la
Therefore,
mémoire
the
qui pose
collection
un
of
certain nombre de
objects
problématiques.
exhibited in community
Qu'est-ce qui doit être
museums is
collecté?
the
Qu'est-ce
result
qui
of a
doit
long-planned
témoigner?
management.
Qu'est-ce qui
It
doit
opens a
témoigner sa
chain of
matière
memory
initiale?
preservation and poses a
On
certain
entre
number of
de bien
problems.
plus
What should be collected?
dans le
Who is going to
développement des musées
testify?
inclusifs
What is going to
et
testify?
collaboratifs.
Its initial
Un élément
material.
caractérisé par la globalisation des échanges et par
We
la
have entered
prise de parole
fully into the
contextuelle.
development of inclusive museums
C'est en
and
rendant les communautés acteurs de leur propre histoire
collaborative
pour mieux
taxation
comprendre les
characterized
enjeux.
by the
Si vous
globalization of
revenez par
exchanges
exemple
and
aux
by
différentes
speaking
photos qu'on
out,
vient de projeter, revenez un peu en
uninhibited.
arrière s'il vous
It is
plaît.
by making
Vous allez
communities
constater que
actors
ces
in their own
musées,
history that we will
dans ces
better
différentes
understand
photos,
the
on montre
issues. If you
comment
come
les
back,
musées gardent leur
for
valeur
example, to the
d'usage.
various
Et les
photos that we
musées
have
sont
just
exposés,
shown,
mais
go back a
lorsqu'ils
bit,
activent pas
please.
sortir ces
You will
objets
notice that it is in
pour
these
nous les
various
mettre
photos.
en
We
valeur.
show how museums keep their value in use. And museums are on display. But when there are certain activities, we are going to take out these objects to highlight them.
Lorsque
Collection site.
vous regardez cette photo,
Next, collections installation.
de donner à voir des œuvres, mais également
When you
d'associer la
look at
fonction
this
culturelle
photo,
à une dimension sociale plus forte. Et dans le chantier de collection, par
it is
exemple,
no
on
longer
va
a
faire
question of
sortir les
showing
objets du
works,
musée.
but
On
also
va
to
sortir les
combine
objets du
cultural
musée pour
function
aider
with a
des personnes
stronger
ressources
social
pour qu'ils
dimension.
puissent
And in
témoigner
this
de la valeur
collections
de ces objets.
project, for example, we
On le
go,
dira jamais
we're going to
assez,
get the items out of the
avoir une
museum.
source n'est
We're
pas
going
avoir
to
de
take the
source.
objects out
C'est
of the
la
museum.
plurivocalité,
Bring in
la
resource persons so that they can
plurivocalité qui
testify to
donne
the
assez
value
de
of these
contenu
objects.
dans la
It is
documentation
said, we
documentation
can't say it
muséale.
enough.
Il
To have a
devient
source
ainsi
is not to have a
essentiel
source.
de
It's
disposer d'une
plurivocality,
multiplicité de voix
the
permettant
plurivocality that will give
à la
enough
production
content
d'un
in
discours
this museum
beaucoup plus
documentation.
près de la
It thus becomes essential to have a multiplicity of voices that allows to the production of a discourse that is much closer to reality. Here, therefore, another equation arises, the recognition of local artists. Because the recognition of local artists allows dialogue to take place. What is the paradox of the 21st century? African art is recognized, but artists don't. And by bringing these people on stage, it makes it possible to document and contribute a lot of knowledge to historicity, to museum documentation. Next, in the third part. Next, in the third part. I tried to show a question that always comes up. In this third part, the acquisition of court objects or ritual objects. Because a question that really arises is whether asking yourself certain court objects does not arise. Worried about secrets to hide? Musical unveiling continues to be perceived as a peril that tended to make preserved objects secret. What you need to know here is that no object in the museum smells without the will of the people. And who are these objects keep their secret value? Every threat has a ritual function. It should be discarded here because the ritual objects are removed from the places of the uninitiated. Indeed, it is done through the agreement and even the participation of the chiefs. It is clear that no object enters the museum against the will of the populations, for their sacredness. As a result, any threat to ritual function seems to have been removed for the collection, musealization, the presentation, the treatment, the conservation of ritual objects. We have frequent and even the populations during these inventories take into account the aspirations of local populations, which means that we can't. You cannot post or photograph certain items that are prohibited. Let's leave these official symbols like masks. Ritual instruments are kept in view of the uninitiated. Next in part 4. I tried to ask the question of the conservation of these ritual objects. Is the conservation of community objects not a concern for conservation? When are some objects going to come out of the exhibition and be used in their use value? What we need to know. What is the conservation or protection function does not concern aesthetic value or history of the object, nor a value of preservation against decoration. Decorating in itself is not a problem. If an object dies, that is to say, he is leaving a quarter of the position that had been assigned to him, the group can still make another object that will have the same value. And that's what you need to know, is that there is no question of authenticity. The object only makes sense when its use value is present. And besides, even Alpha Omer Konare said it about this type of object that this conservation, when it exists, is less about the object than the mind. It is in the field of continuity, of repetition, of the gesture, of the transmission, know-how and preventive conservation. So in that sense, populations have empirical knowledge oriented towards respect for traditions whose actions influence significantly on their conservation the rights. The enclosure cults and the initiatory ceremonies magnify the will of the community to preserve and pass on assets. Social prohibitions are also reflected in the code of conduct, the social pact, traditional religion, the chiefdoms and the most important strategies. The most significant in this approach will aim to have a conservation approach. Preventive. Endogenous practices include elements related to sacralization, to conservation by secret societies, which means that, speaking of preventive conservation, while certain rights and social prohibitions will contribute to the preservation of objects of worship, if the object were to be stolen, whoever he stole will either be banned from society, rejected and banned from the community. This means that therefore it is community have several unwritten ways to preserve objects. And here, there is one more very important element in this know-how. In this way of communicating the transmission of intangible heritage, instead of worrying about keeping the object in its physical form, it is a question of maintaining the practice of the object through communication, even more so through transmission. Several elements contribute to use intangible heritage, not just material heritage, because when we design most of our museums today, intangible heritage is being put aside when it is a very important element. For example, during certain ceremonies organized in communities. The songs, the tears, and the sounds. The tam-tam refers to messages that urge, celebrate life. All of these activities are not only limited to the dead, but also takes forms of artistic representations and constitutes a case of reconstruction and even conservation, for the conservation of African art. And I tried to ask myself a question in part 4, which was endogenous financing. How do these museums, or are they able to find funding? We all know it. We can't say it enough. Museum institutions are institutions that devour the money they can generate thanks to one, in these communities. Even if there are difficulties in collecting resources, thanks to mobilization, admittedly unstructured, but whose theorization can provide a lot of information, a lot of solutions, a lot of effective solutions in museum financing. Some communities, thanks to what I called community sponsorship. What does that mean? Community elites will contribute to the financing of museographic projects because national museums have become a symbol of the prestige and positioning of communities. And it's the fact that, instead of seeking government funding, which is more and more difficult, foreign funding is difficult. These communities will rely on the elites to finance their own museums, and this funding is sometimes enormous, depending on the adherence of the elites to their leaders and their communities. That's what we can say. Is the attachment the identity attachment of communities to their group brings? They are also possible sources of funding that can be theorized through community sponsorship. I would thus say that the conclusions that museums are increasingly adopting heritage to make themselves known in their complexity and identity. The African Museum must dialogue, that is to say, living the present while revisiting the past. Because the harmonization of these communities and social cohesion are at stake, work is needed to deconstruct the Western model. There is no question, and there was no question in this study, in this presentation, to claim a certain humanity, a certain Africanity or a certain Cameroonity, but a shift. A redistribution of the new cultural and epistemological cartography in relation to a globalized world. In fact, museums throughout their community should no longer consider themselves being a representation of their community. He must consider it not only as his subject of study and heritage, but also as a subject for cultural and educational action. That was what I wanted to tell you in terms of conclusion. And with that, I will therefore pass the floor to Dauda Keita for the rest of her presentation. Thank you.
Merci, cher collègue Hugues. Je joins ma voix à la tienne pour remercier Princeton University.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Hugh, I join my voice to yours in thanking Princeton University for having associated us with this important event that will allow us a bit to talk about a new museology and an African museology, if one allows one to speak in this way. And after you who talked a lot about community museums, so I am continuing in the same way to present a communication about what we called cultural banks, and this initiative was born out of collaboration with American colleagues who were in Mali and who were in the Peace Corps. So it is based on certain observations that we have thought of setting up such a structure next. So, the observation was made that we started to see that the looting of archaeological sites and the illicit sale of cultural goods was beginning to gain momentum, and despite the existence of legislative texts, this phenomenon was going to this phenomenon was taking on a scale that was beginning to frighten, and we know that the disappearance of these treasures really is a huge loss for communities. So it is in this context that we thought together to set up a structure that will allow both to preserve the cultural heritage locally and also to ensure that the community can benefit from their heritage in its usual context. And hence the name of this institution as a cultural bank. Next. So, a cultural bank. This is where cultural heritage is preserved. So it's a local institution that is at the service of the whole community, and it initiates and develops protective actions, the promotion of local cultural heritage in general, of resources as well. That's what allows populations to generate from their own population, to mobilize cultural resources in a sustainable manner and also meet their social and cultural needs, and that's it. Next. So that's why a cultural bank, it's a project that wanted to offer an alternative to selling cultural objects and looting, and also, one of the major objectives, it is to preserve and enhance cultural heritage locally, and thirdly, it is to link culture and development, because that's very important, because we saw that, the looting was increasing because the population had a certain need, so if we want to limit this scourge, we must offer them an alternative that would allow the populations to win resources and without, carry out the looting. So why is that? So that's where we thought, at the, cultural bank. Next slide. So you see a cultural bank at the, unlike many institutions, is a multifaceted institution. So we have three parts. We have a village museum, we have a microcredit center, and we have a cultural center. So it's the combination of these three elements that form a cultural bank. So the elements, taken, aside, cannot make it possible to set up a cultural bank. It is the set that forms the cultural bank. And why are we going to see it? Right away. Next slide. So you see, the first part, it's the village museum. So the museum is, like all museums, is intended to collect the conservation and exhibition of objects. But you should know that these objects come mainly from communities. It is the community that brings their objects at the cultural bank, and also something from. What is very important is that it must be said that these objects are inventoried, documented, before being put into the, in the collection, and most importantly, it's just, we tried to, as much as possible to do all this documentation in the language, local. Why in the local language? Because the community did not go to French school and therefore trying to do this work in their place. So we were going to replace her a bit. So we have. There have been forms of literacy training to enable this community to manage itself their cultural bank. Next slide. And so you see a number of documents that are essential to the life of the cultural bank. So it is. These documents are there, the catalog sheet, the historical sheet, and the loan sheet. So the catalog sheet and the historical sheet allow communities to, to provide information on their objects. That's important for, future generations. So it is a question of collecting most of the information from the community about, these objects, and therefore on the basis of the information received. So we're giving out a loan for, to the owner, and for that is important. Why is it not based on the aesthetic value that the loan is? Granted, it depends on the historical value. That is important. Why? Because you have to look for information. It is necessary to document well so that future generations can experience wealth, cultural life of the locality, and once you give out a loan. So, we were trying to initiate AGRs, income generating activities, to enable the community to take care of things differently and to generate resources that can be used to fight against, to be able to, allow the community to help you financially, the family to manage, some issues.
Comme je l'ai dit, la banque
Next
culturelle
slide.
ne
So
vend
you
pas un
see,
objet,
here,
un objet. L'objet de la banque
as I
culturelle
say,
appartient à la communauté. Et donc,
the cultural
même
bank
si
does
l'objet
not sell an
est
object or buy
déposé,
an
l'objet
object.
continue à
The object of
appartenir
cultural
au
banking
propriétaire.
belongs to the
Peut-être
community,
en cas de
and so,
besoin,
even if the
venir
object
chercher
is deposited,
son bien,
the
peut le
object
faire si
continues to
besoin,
belong to the
avec
owner, and the
gratuité.
owner, in case
Ça veut dire
of
que si
need,
c'est
can
un
come and get
objet qui
his
est
property,
inhabituel,
go do what he
s'il veut se
wants,
faire
and then he
saisir,
reports.
il peut venir prendre son objet,
So that
aller
means if
faire
it's a
son
cultural or
contenu,
ritual
et après,
object,
il ramène
so if the
l'objet.
need arises,
Donc,
he can
ce que
come
nous
and take his
appelons
object,
de parler d'objet vivant.
go to
Il
worship,
revient
and
avec
then he brings the object
l'objet,
back.
et l'objet est toujours, comme l'a dit toujours,
So what allowed us to
c'est cher,
talk about living
tout de
objects?
suite.
Because there is
Et
contact
l'objet
between the owner
continue à être
and the
vivant.
object, and the
L'objet
object
continue
is
à vivre.
always, as I
Donc,
always said,
ça, c'est très important, ce qu'on doit vivre avec les objets. Quand je
completely
viens d'une
naked.
banque
The
culturelle
object
et
continues
les
to be
objets
used.
d'un
The
musée,
object continues to live, and I think that is very
l'objet
important.
est vraiment utilisé comme
What makes the
une
difference between the objects in a cultural bank and the objects in a museum? Normal.
il y
So
a
the
des
object
objets
is really
comme,
used properly, and
il y a aussi des objets sacrés, des objets rituels qui ne
there
sont
are
pas
items
initiés
like,
ou non initiés.
there are
Dans la
also
banque culturelle,
sacred
nous avons
objects,
initié
ritual
une
objects that
partie
are
qui
not
s'appelle la
accessible to the
cachette.
uninitiated.
Donc, dans cette
So in the
cachette,
cultural bank, we have,
propriétaires d'objets de
insider,
culte
a
venaient
part that was
déposer
called the
ces
sacred
objets
cast.
et on
So
les
in this
remettait
sacred
dans
cast,
l'armoire. Mais le plus important pour nous, c'était
the owners of objects
documenter
of worship came to
inventarier
drop off these
ces
objects, and
objets
we handed
dans
them
la banque
over.
culturelle
The
de
key to the
l'Inaugural.
closet.
Et
But the
aussi
most important thing for us
de
was,
faire en sorte pour
to
sauver
document,
ces objets du vol. Parce qu'on sait que
to
dans la
inventory
communauté,
these
c'est
objects in the
devenu important
cultural
de sauver
heritage
cela,
of the
parce qu'on sait que
locality, and
ceci,
also
dans
to
les
make
banques
sure to
et
save these
les
objects from
bandits
theft.
peuvent
Because we know that in
savoir
our communities,
leur
these important
emplacement et
objects are left
les
in the sacred woods, are left in the trees, and,
facilement.
bandits can know the location, their
espace
location, and steal them. So,
où les gens
easily.
peuvent apprendre beaucoup de choses. Et d'où,
So it's
donc,
also
ici, en
a
venant,
space where
on
people
peut
can learn a lot
découvrir
about
cet objet,
things, and from where,
connaître
and
des
so,
informations sur cet
also,
objet,
coming in,
connaître,
we can talk to this
comment
object
se
and get to
situer,
know,
à quel point
information
les
about this
informations
object,
sur
get to know,
l'objet qui est
how,
exposé à la
actually,
banque culturelle. Next slide, s'il vous plaît.
know all the information about,
Et donc, le microcrédit,
the object that is on display at the cultural bank. Next slide.
c'est pas possible.
And so the
D'accord,
microcredit
donc
Professor
le
Dauda.
microcrédit
Let
est,
me remind you that
donc,
you have
next
1
slide.
minute left. It's not possible. All right.
Et le centre culturel est important
So the
pour le
microcredit
microcrédit,
is
c'est là
therefore
où,
next slide.
on initie les activités génératrices de
And the
revenus pour
cultural
permettre
center
à
is
la
important
population de
because, as I
contrôler
said, that's where,
la communauté et aussi essayer
income generating
besoins
activities are
dans
initiated to
différentes
enable the
activités.
population
Next
to
slide.
fight against poverty and also, try to improve yourself in different
La banque
activities.
culturelle est gérée
Next slide.
essentiellement par
So you
la
see
communauté qui gère. On a l'Assemblée générale, on a le comité de gestion, on a le comité
the
de
cultural
suivi
bank
et
is
le
managed
comité
mainly by
de
the
pilotage.
community,
L'équipe technique
the
qui est là
community that
pour
manages.
apporter des
We have the
avis
general
dans
meeting.
la gestion
We have the
des
management committee.
activités
We have the credit committee and the
à la
committee of
communauté
wise men.
et
So the
gens sont
technical team
sollicités
is there
là.
to provide
Next slide.
support. If not, management is in charge.
Donc,
To the
comme
community.
avantage,
And I think
il
that
y a
it is a
plusieurs
very
avantages.
important
Il y a-
thing.
il y a- il y a
Next slide.
des avantages
So as an
de protection
advantage,
et de sauvegarde
there are several advantages.
culturelle,
There
mais
is.
il y a aussi le fait que l'objet dans son contexte
There are benefits of
habituel
protecting and
devient,
maintaining heritage.
une source de revenus pour la population. Et
Cultural, and there is
l'objet
also the
devient un
fact that the
espace
object in its usual
ouvert,
context
vivant,
becomes
où la communauté devient responsable de
a source of
l'entretien
income for the
de ceci.
population, and the cultural bank is
Donc, voilà
an
un peu
open,
ce
living
que je
space
voulais dire, concernant
where
ce
the
centre
community becomes
culturel, et
responsible for
j'espère
its
que vous
social
prenez attention.
development,
Et
cultural.
en attendant
So
la
that's kind of
conclusion,
what I wanted to
je demande
say.
à mon collègue Hervé de prendre la
About
parole
this
et
cultural
répondre à
bank, and
vos
I hope
questions.
there are a lot of questions. And while waiting for your questions, I ask my colleague Hervé to take the floor and to make his presentation. Thank you.
Merci de me passer la parole, cher Rodrigue. Ma communication dans le
Thanks for
cadre
giving me the
de
floor.
la
Dear Rodrigue,
thématique soumise à ce panel portera sur la présentation de
my communication within the
concepts,
framework of the
notamment visage de masque et passerelle.
Themes submitted to this panel will focus on the presentation of two
L'usage des masques
projects,
interroge l'impact de la colonisation
including
sur la
face mask and
production
contemporary
de
footbridge.
masques rituels et cultuels en Afrique aujourd'hui. Il nous invite aussi à
Face and
reconnaître
mask
d'une
question the
réalisation
impact of
hybride
colonization on the production of
s'inscrit
ritual
dans
and
une
cultural
mobilité
masks in
incessante
Africa today,
entre
and also
l'univers de
invites
la
us to
création
discover a hybrid
contemporaine
creation
locale
that
et l'univers du rituel en Afrique.
is part of an
Il faut
incessant
préciser que ce
mobility
projet
between the
se
world
dresse
of global
également contre
contemporary creation
les
and
clichés
the world
de
of ritual in
colonisation
Africa.
dans lesquels les productions en provenance
It
d'Afrique
should be noted that this
sont
project
souvent
also
transférées.
opposes stereotypes
Le projet visage de masque repose sur une
and the
série
categorizations in which productions from
collaboration.
Africa are often locked
Collaboration
up.
avec les artisans, collaboration avec
The
la
Face of the
communauté
Mask project is
locale,
based on a series of
collaboration
collaborations.
avec les responsables des musées
Collaborations with artists in collaboration with
Pour ce
communities,
qui est de la collaboration
local,
avec les artisans,
in
ces
collaboration
derniers
with
sont
Western
conviés
museum officials,
à contribuer
in
à la
terms of
réalisation
collaboration with
des
artisans.
masques issus de ce projet, qui prennent la forme de
They are
masques.
invited to contribute to
Il faut dire que la nécessité de
the
cette
production
collaboration
of
repose
masks
aussi
resulting
sur
from
la
this
volonté
project, which
de
take the form of
convier
hybrid masks.
ces
It
talentueux
must be
artisans
said that the need for this
à
collaboration
la
lies
création contemporaine. Parce qu'il faut préciser que bon nombre d'entre eux
is based on
sont
the desire to
employés
invite these
dans
talented
la
artisans
copie
to contemporary
de
creation,
masques classiques africains
because
qui
it should be noted that many of them are stuck
sont
in
dans les collections des musées outre-Atlantique.
a copy of classical African masks that
Les artisans concernés par cette
are in the
collaboration
collections
sont
of museums
des artisans
across the
sculpteurs,
Atlantic.
comme on l'a en image, des perliers et perlières,
The artisans involved in this collaboration are
des
sculptors like
accessoiristes
us.
et
The image of pearls
parfois
and
des
pearls,
costumiers en fonction des masques qui sont produits.
prop
La
artists, and
collaboration avec
sometimes
les
costume designers,
communautés
depending
locales,
on the masks that are
nous
produced.
avons ici en image une phase
For collaboration
chant
with local
avec
communities,
Monsieur Etienne Djombi qui est le taku de Balassier. Le taku,
here
c'est
we
le
have an
taku de la
exchange phase in
colonisation.
images.
Parce qu'une fois que le masque que j'ai réalisé en collaboration avec
With
les
Mr.
artisans
Etienne
est
Jem, who is running out of time.
je le présente au responsable de cette
He is the
communauté
master of the Kunga
là-bas,
Brotherhood because
conserving
once the
là-bas.
mask that I made in
Une fois que
collaboration
le
with the
masque
artisans
produit,
is
il est
available, I present it to the
utilisable
leaders of this
d'entrée
community,
dans la
in
confrérie.
particular the Kunga Brotherhood,
Et parfois, la décision finale
so they can
vient
evaluate
de
the
la part du
mask and
monarque
tell
qui
me
doit
if it can be
rencontrer
used
également
by them in the
et qui
Brotherhood.
doit présenter le projet. À la fin,
And
c'est
sometimes the final
le-
decision comes from the monarch I have to
l'aval
meet.
de ces derniers. J'ai l'assurance que
Also,
le
and to
masque
whom should I present the
que j'ai
project
produit
at the end of?
peut
The
être
endorsement
conduit
of the
dans
latter.
l'univers rituel. Les masques hybrides
I have the
permettent
assurance that the
aux
mask I
communautés de
produced
collaboration, notamment de la
can be
création
led
des
into the
artisans,
ritual universe.
commencent leur vie comme objet
Hybrid
d'exposition
masks are
pour
the
la
product of these
circulation.
multiple collaborations and in particular of collaboration
Après,
with the artisans, start their
rentrent dans
life as an
l'univers
exhibition
rituel
object
pour mener une vie d'entité.
on the contemporary scene and after entering the universe.
Là, les masques ont
Ritual to lead a
sont
life
des
of
masques,
entities,
des masques
alive,
classiques
there.
qui font la fierté des musées en Occident. Ces
Masks have a
peuvent
different
avoir
background.
commencé leur vie comme objet
Classic masks that are the pride of museums in the West. These masks, they started their life as an object,
Ici, les masques
ritual
commencent
or
leur vie
court
comme
object, and
objet
ended up like,
d'exposition avant de
exhibition
retourner
object
dans
here.
l'univers rituel. Il faut dire que le masque comme objet
Masks
d'exposition
began their life
est
as an
devenu la
exhibition object
colonisation.
before return to the ritual universe.
La
It must be said
quasi-totalité
that the
des
mask,
artistes plasticiens qui
as an
viennent
exhibition
avec les
object,
masques
is the fruit of
sont reconnus
colonization
comme
and,
objet
today,
d'exposition. Dans le cadre de ce projet, il était
almost all
indispensable
visual artists who deal with masks
que je ne me
produce
limite
it
pas
as an
à cette
exhibition
fonction
object. As part of this
et
project,
redonne au masque sa fonction, notamment au
it
masque
was
rituel,
essential for me that I not limit myself to
donc
this
de
function,
lui permettre de retourner à
but that I
l'univers
restore
rituel
the mask to its
être une entité
function,
vivante.
especially to ritual masks, its
Quelle est la
original
valeur
function.
symbolique de
So
ce
to allow him to
renaissance?
return to the ritual universe,
C'est une sorte de
to be a
thérapie.
living entity, what is
C'est
the
important
symbolic
pour moi, à un
value
moment
of this
donné,
counter-meaning?
de
For me,
poser un
it's a
acte
kind of
révélateur,
psychological therapy. It's
fût-il
important for
symbolique,
us,
comme c'est le cas
at some point in time of, do a reparative act, even if it is symbolic, as is the case here, in order to be able to register for a new beginning. And that's what we're talking about at this level. The masks, after being in the ritual universe sometimes, stand out to be presented in museums or art centers, in Africa or in Europe. Now we have the Natty Kong mask that is his, featured in the Domsnil collection. In an exhibition at the Domsnil collection. It was in 2023 and we can notice that the mask here is surrounded by a series of objects that are objects closely related to its function, in particular. The box that allows you to transport it and allow it to move. From one continent to another, from one country to another. Photography. The video that are captures of the life of mask in the ritual universe. We also have the shipping documentation and the cartel. It should be noted that here these masks are part of one in a back and forth motion between the scene, contemporary art and the ritual universe, and finally take on an ambivalent identity that makes a rigid barrier that species have always built between what is of the order of the work of art and what is the order of the ritual object. Western museums today have a duty to review their projects. Conservation insofar as the gaze cast on the artifacts and the objects from Africa has evolved enormously, changed enormously. It is important that some rooms that appear in Western museum collections return to Africa playing their role as an agent of social cohesion, because it should be noted that among the artifacts that are kept in these museums, there are some that are entities. Rituals misleadingly called ritual objects. During colonization, all the artifacts found in Africa were considered objects, but not all of them are objects. And so, as part of the face of the masks, the desire is that museums that have purchased a few pieces of this project allow these pieces to return to the ritual universe, to continue their function as agents of social cohesion. It is essential. Passerelle Contemporaine is a series of creative residencies designed to enrich community museums in Africa with works of contemporary plastic art. In other words, to contribute to building bridges between the past and the present through collection of museum works of art. This workshop invites contemporary visual artists to immerse yourself in the world of African heritage and deal with this heritage for their creations. The first edition of Passerelle's Contemporains was held in Baby, which is a second-level chiefdom located in the western region of Cameroon. It must be said that this project is structured in 3 stages. The first is that of making contact. That is to say, the impregnation with the heritage of the Bapa community, and not only the Bapa community, because the impregnation phase extends to the region of Western Cameroon. It is a moment of visit, museum visit, magnificent museum. Visit the falls of the various elements of the culture of the region of the West in general. The second phase is that of creation, where each artist after this phase of impregnation, enters the phase of sound design work and then move on to the implementation phase. And after this implementation phase,
faut préciser que
We have the
chaque
last
artiste
phase,
a
which is that of the
l'obligation
exhibition.
d'offrir une œuvre au
Of the
musée.
works produced during the workshop,
Donc,
and it should be noted that
je
each
dois
artist
m'assurer
has
qu'à la fin de ce projet de
the obligation to
6
donate a work to the
créations
Bapa Museum and
plastiques contemporaines faites par des artistes plasticiens qui ont pris
so
part
Dad's
à ce
museum was
projet.
enriched at
Des
the end
artistes
of
qu'on
this
peut voir
project
en
by
image autour du monarque
6
qui est,
contemporary plastic creations made by visual
l'unité
artists who
photographique.
take part in this project.
Ce
Artists
projet
that can be
pastel
seen in
contemporain
images
nous
around the monarch
enfonce
who is,
dans
in the middle of
un problème
photography.
qui est celui de la grande hémorragie
This
dans
Passerelle's
l'univers de
Contemporains
la
project
création
finds its
contemporaine
source
produite en Afrique qui
in a problem which
actuellement
is that of the large
a des
hemorrhage that we
destinations dans le
observe.
monde.
Currently contemporary creations produced in
Cela se fait
Africa,
au moment même où on parle de
who leaves the
la
continent to
restitution du
various
patrimoine
destinations in the world.
d'hier. N'oublions pas que les œuvres
And
qui
this
sont
is being done at the
produites
very moment when we are talking about
seront
the return
forcément le
of
patrimoine
heritage of
d'hier.
yesterday.
Et donc, il était pour moi important
Let's not
de
forget that the
réagir
works
face à
that are
cette
produced
situation.
today will
Et la
necessarily
mauvaise
be the
contribution qui a été mienne a été celle
heritage of tomorrow, and therefore
d'initier
it
ce
was
projet
important for me to
tout
react to
la
this
temporalité
situation, and my
d'une
modest contribution
dynamique.
was that of
La première édition s'est tenue en
to
octobre
initiate this project, which had the temporality of a
2023
biennial.
Bapa.
The first edition took place in
La deuxième
2000.
édition, ce sera en 2025. Le lieu n'est pas encore
In
décidé,
October
mais
2023
nous
in
pouvons
Baba.
noter que
The second edition, it will be in 2025. The location has not yet been decided, but we can note that
de s'enrichir de nouvelles créations, des créations qui sont des œuvres d'art
this
d'artistes
project
contemporains,
allows the
donc
community
d'artistes
museum in
vivants.
Africa
Et
to be
par le
enriched.
truchement de ce
New
projet,
creations,
nous
creations that
pouvons
are,
être
works of
assurés
art,
que
of contemporary
demain,
artists, so of today's
tous les enfants
artists.
n'auront pas
And through this
forcément
project,
l'obligation de
we can be
chercher un
reassured that
pèlerinage
tomorrow,
pour aller découvrir nos travaux, nous artistes
not all our
africains,
children will necessarily have to
dans
seek
les
to
musées
obtain visas to go and discover our work. We, African
découvrir les
artists of
travaux de
today,
création.
in museums outside the continent.
Merci.
Thank you for your attention.
Trois panélistes pour vos différentes communications d'une très grande valeur avec
Thanks to our three panelists
donc qui vont tout justement à ce moment nourrir nos
for your various
discussions.
highly valuable communications with lots of information. And so,
Conforter avec moi que
which are
nous
going to
avons
feed our
vraiment
discussions
tout
right
œuvré
now.
en étant en en faire une très bonne gestion du fait que nous avons
And so you will
commencé
see
avec
with me that we are
ce
going
programme qui doit s'arrêter à 18h.
really running behind the times by going to do a very good management of the fact that we started with a slight delay. This program is due to end at 6 p.m. just now. And so we're going to balance the discussions I'm going to have earlier with our panelists, so as to take questions from the audience. So then, to begin with, I would like to ask a question to Professor Hughes. Professor Hughes, you talked about of community museums and so in the Cameroonian context with the very mechanism of acquiring objects for enrich this museum. But the question I'm asking myself that in the current environment, at least, in sub-Saharan Africa, with the religious movement who are winning their place, and we know more or less with all the mystification around objects, we're going to say objects of worship and the like. How do you, awareness raising is organized for, to get communities to join such a project? Thanks for the question asked. What to say here? It's that the heritage has become nowadays, in these communities, a new paradigm of urban development. What to say, and even museums. New urban development paradigms and even museums. Heritage are taken back by power, by traditional power. In most communities, each community wants to have its own museum. And this is not forced. And it is with the support of the local community. You will see that in these communities, we bring in the dignitaries who hold certain symbolic objects of the community and they participate voluntarily. You saw this photo without having voluntarily gone to the collection site, and it is with a pleasure, and it's even a symbol, even also of strategic positioning of the community and even of the leadership in this in that way to say that. And here, what should we say is it? There is no threat to ritual objects because they give voluntarily, and objects that do not, can't be seen are kept in secret societies. Among the initiates, it is exclusively the objects that can be seen, affected, which are exhibited in their museums, and in some communities, you will see, there are two types of museums. There is the museum for the public. There is the museum for the public and the museum for traditional societies or those that are not seen by communities. And I gave another element here, which will still give you some ideas. When I try to talk about community sponsorship, that's because even for financial concerns, the boss, the dignitaries will go to their elites who will raise the funds to finance these museums. And it becomes a symbol of pride for the community. It becomes a symbol where and it is this museum that the community is putting forward to project itself into this current world. It's a movement, and that's what we're seeing anyway when the theater closes. Movie theaters close the museums, we from the coast. There is a kind of museum. A museum at the community level, and what makes them do that? So there is, when trying to do statistics between the years 2000 and 2024, at least, there were at least 80% of museums created in Cameroon within communities. But not even, state museums, there is a real favorable wind for the context of the museum. The museum is seized by traditional power, and it is not a threat to traditional religions. Because ritual objects remain in all rights. They don't go to these museums. And in addition, even some of the objects that go into this museum, if they were objects, there are certain decentralized rights for entering museums. I know we got what I'm trying to say. What is it? It's not the physical object that's the most important. It is the spirit around the object that is most important. The object can be destroyed, but it is the value of that is most important. So material objects. So there can be activations, deactivations, and deactivations of these objects. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, teacher. IG for that answer. Professor Dauda, the Cultural Bank project is a real example, reconciling conservation and development. We understood this well through your communication. But I would like to bounce back on the aspect of fight against the illicit trafficking of cultural goods that you mention in your communication. So, within the framework of the 1960 UNESCO Convention, before and after the Cultural Bank, what is the real impact, let's say, of the Cultural Bank on the fight against illicit trafficking, cultural goods in Mali? Thank you so much for this question. So, as we did not have enough time to talk about cultural goods, so I can say that the cultural effects on communities in this area are positive. Positive? Why? Because awareness is what you need to succeed in reducing this scourge. Because fighting against the illicit trafficking of cultural goods is not easy. And like I said, poverty makes people engage in this practice. So if we want to fight, an alternative must be proposed. That's what the cultural brand came for. And so communities must be empowered. You have to inform them, raise their awareness, and involve them in the fight against the plunder of archaeological sites. Because you need to say something. This is because this plunder is happening in communities. So somewhere, communities are actors in what is happening. So by empowering and involving them, I think they will become aware of the importance of their cultural heritage, and they will know the value of the treasure that is hidden under their feet and what makes them go. Finally, realize the importance of maintaining this and maintaining that, not only their heritage, but also they preserve, because, by studying this heritage correctly, you can rewrite history. So it's kind of, make them take responsibility for their story and, in the locality where the banks were located, we felt that, it was the communities that forbade people even to take an object from an archaeological site. So that's the most important thing. It is necessary to inform, raise awareness, and when these two actions are good, understood, and that we see that by trying to keep the object locally, we can take advantage. I think it's another that we call that. It's another kettle of fish that makes you prefer to keep the object because someone said it. I think that if our objects go there, we will all be forced to go there, and those who cannot go, so they will lose. I think it's better to keep the objects locally. Take advantage and also keep that for generations, futures. That is very important for us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Dauda. I would like to now see a question addressed to Hervé Yumbi, who presented these two draft projects to us, which really take account of the major current debates, particularly on issues of restitution, but seen from an approach, fairly new, in a logical way, from the bottom inverted. So starting from Africa, but I would just like to, first ask a question. It's how our communities, I am going as part of the first project that you presented. How do communities welcome, changes in the mask statuses of an object? For example, exposure to its ritual function. Does the transition happen without problem, and how do they perceive it? It should be said that, thanks for the question, but it should be said that, everything is based on the logic of the procedure that has been put in place. Because to produce an object, a mask, let's specify it. Who aspires to return to the ritual universe to lead a ritual life? You must first, know what the elements are optional and mandatory in the constitution of the mask in question. And so that means that you have to study first the realities of this brotherhood, their function, study the specificities of objects and entities that the brotherhood manipulates to be able to do this proposal there. And I think that the process that was mine was a logical process. That's what led to the validation of the objects I have made, and one thing led to another. Well, it was done simply, and they saw the validity of the act that I took and accepted. So there you go. That's how things happened. I'm going to stay with you, Hervé, to ask an additional question, because who decides in the end? Who finally decides when and how? From the release of the masks of the ritual universe, around, to exhibition sites, for example, it all depends on of the agreement between us. Because in reality I am making the mask. I have him confronted by the leaders of the brotherhood who see if the mask corresponds to the needs of the said brotherhood. Let me take a very simple example. When I first presented a mask that I made, and I made it for a specific person, a friend, Hervé, who was a young member of this brotherhood, the first question I was asked, it was, how many horns does this mask have? Because in fact you had to know that the number of horns corresponded to the grade of the mask wearer. So these are the kinds of things you need to know. And I explained the project to them. I made it clear to them that today the mask begins their life as an exhibition object. Because exhibiting a mask has become something common since the advent of colonization. But that I did not want my masks to have only this function, and therefore that these masks should also have the function, have another original function to play the role that is his in the chain. There it is, social in the community. speech that they understood very well because it is also necessary. It must be admitted, a certain open-mindedness. I was lucky that the very first monarch I met was a lawyer. So someone who was, really open to all these questions of openness of Africa and of development, of our ways and customs. So it goes on and so it has. He understood the issues very well and agreed to allow this to happen. And so, there you go. This is what made possible these movements from the virtual universe object to, the universe, of exhibition. And it must be said that what Hughes was saying earlier, they are ritual masks. So this means that when the mask is in the hands of the Brotherhood, it is no longer the object but me. I realized, it's something else. Until he gave me the mask for the exhibition. And so he was talking earlier about the charging and discharging of the mask that occurs at that moment. So, there you go. Professor Hughes, I am coming back to you. I would like to understand a little bit. We would like to understand the communitarianism of this museum and the inaccessibility of certain objects to this same community. How can we explain that? I don't see. What if there is a problem between inaccessibility? What is the problem? What should be presented to the public and what should be seen? And just now, I will try to specify the purpose for you. It's not the physical object that matters. It is the load around this object that is the most important here. When the object is loaded, it stays in your teeth. It stays with the dawn, with the initiates, among the notable ones. When the object is unloaded, it goes back to the museum and it's accessible. And it is accessible. Anyone can touch it. Anyone can have access to this object. But when it's loaded, it is no longer accessible to everyone. It is not the material object that should be put forward. It is the charge that is around this object. It's not the aesthetic aspect. It's not the plastic aspect. It's the load around this object. And in Africa, what will connect most community museums? The object only has meaning for its use value. Only at its value. There it is, when I speak. I'm trying to talk about community museology or museology of context and this attempt at theorizing the museology of background. In fact, the object is linked to its context. That is it. The same object can be seen and touched by everyone and at some point, it can no longer be seen and touched by everyone. In fact, even the preventive conservation aspect. It is not the physical object itself that we keep, and the object can be preserved by sacralization. When an object is sacred, we can't steal it from you, even if you steal its object. Could die, that's a fact. So it will contribute to the preservation of the object by the, when we talk about the endogenous conservation of objects, sacralization, social prohibitions. So it's not a limiting aspect or not. It is the use value that makes the object what it is, what may or may not be seen at a certain point in time. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I'll be back around, Professor Dauda to understand a bit. How does the cultural bank ensure its functioning from a financial point of view? Since it was understood that communities are the ones who contribute their object at the bank and the bank assured them of loans to develop activities generating of resources and what is the how? How? The bank ensures its operation since it seems to me that everything is going in the right direction. To be logical. No. Lucrative, but how does banking work in the end? Thank you so much for this question. In fact, at the beginning, there is working capital that is left to the community by the technical team. So this working capital, the first loans are being granted based on this. And when you give out a loan, so there is a certain, a small interest rate that must be paid. And so it's like a kind of tontine and who does that when you repay? So the loan is granted to others. Yes. So now we're giving you a loan for 3 months, and so if we take out a loan for 3 months, so every time you pay back, so we give loans to some. And then, well, I didn't have time to talk because there are individual loans, group loans, and so the value of the loans also varies according to the historical importance of things. And 4, watch this loan. There is the committee of wise men who is there, who's watching over, about the fact that people have to repay properly, and so, everything that is earned in the cultural bank, as interest, is reinvested in the village. Money does not come out. So that means that communities have an interest in repaying for social works, can be achieved in the community. Yes. So, really, that's it. It is done by, for, and with the community. So the money is given at the limit and nothing comes out of the village. So it's this bearing that allows. So everything that is generated is reinvested. Everything that is generated is reinvested. And if there is added value, it is added value. Is involved in social work in the village to allow the villagers to still benefit from the benefits of cultural banking. Thank you so much. Thank you all, dear panelists. Hervé, Professor Hughes, Professor Dauda, for your answers in this discussion that we have just initiated based on your presentations, and therefore I was saying that we will manage the time allotted for as well as possible. This session, it is 5:38 p.m. In principle, we are already going to start the second part. So of our discussions by taking questions from the audience. And so I'm going to read the questions, which exactly are left here by the various participants, addressed to our various panelists. Martin Alunga and Luga, who are addressing a question to Professor Higgs, to say, do ritual objects really have a place in museums? So it's Dr. Salamatu who asks this question to Professor Hughes. I prefer that you can. I am asking you the audience questions for each one and you answer all at once. Professor Hughes, another question from Tylo Countsy, who asks, he asks several questions. I am taking one of these questions. Do donor communities or societies consider the museum to be a better place to preserve than their own community? That. It's Tilali's question to Professor Hughes. I had another question from Thierry Coussiet at Professor Keita Dauda. Hope I'm not fast. Enables you to write down these questions. He thanks you for sharing your work with cultural banks. He not only says that he explains why communities decide to deposit objects at museums, for very different reasons. No, but it seems to me that this is not a question in itself. It's a comment. To Martin's question. Hello to all panelists. The question of conservation and ritual objects, and for every day precisely, they address the question to all panelists. All reproduce the concept of museum and cultural bank. However, were there no endogenous conservation structures in Africa before creation? Museum or bank that are the preserve of Westerners? That. It's a question for all of the panelists. Another question comes from Andre Louise. Louise Berman says thank you for the communications shared with everyone. Please. The question is to Professor Dauda. Can you elaborate a bit more on microloans? Who can receive it? And who organizes its financial resources? Where do these come from? So, where does the funding come from? And I'm going to take one last question. It's a question to the three panelists coming from Olivier Amana. Sleep in relation to the question of the return of assets. Do you think that cultural policy in sub-Saharan Africa is taken seriously by public authorities? Dear panelists, you have the answer. Talk to whoever wants to take it first to answer, depending on whether the questions that are addressed to you.
D'accord, je vais commencer si cela est bien
All right.
possible. Donc, la première question qui est adressée à tout le monde est s'il y
I
avait
will
des
start if that
structures de
becomes
conservation
possible.
endogènes antérieures à la période
So the
coloniale,
first question
j'étais
addressed to
tombé
me that is
que
addressed to
chez
everyone: what if there
nous,
were structures
dans
of
les bois
previous
sacrés,
endogenous
on pouvait
preservation
bien conserver
in the
ceci.
colonial period? But I
Et
would say
puis,
yes.
dans les
At our
vestibules,
house, in the sacred
les
woods,
vestibules étaient aussi des lieux
we could keep the
privilégiés de
objects
conservation
well, and
spirituelle.
also, in the
Et aussi,
hall.
on savait
In the
que
hall
les
were
responsables de
also
communauté
privileged
aussi
places for the
gardaient
conservation of objects.
les
And
objets.
also we knew that,
Et donc, je crois
the
que la conservation a commencé avec la colonisation
community
européenne,
leaders
puisqu'on
also
avait
guarded the
demandé à nous
objects.
de conserver, de traiter
And
ces
so to
objets.
believe that
Et
conservation
ici au
started
Mali, on a
with,
fait une étude sur les
colonization,
méthodes
I
traditionnelles
would
de
say no,
conservation
because we had our own means to maintain,
des objets.
to
Donc,
treat objects. And
nous sommes
here in
allés dans
Mali,
les localités où les communautés nous ont expliqué
we did a
comment
study
ils
on traditional
conservaient et comment ils
conservation
conservaient et
methods
comment ils
and,
traitaient les objets.
objects,
Ce sont des
including.
méthodes
We went to the
très
places where,
sûres,
the
efficaces
community explained to us
et
how to keep
sans
them and how they
chimiques,
preserved and
qui étaient
how
faits
they treated
avec
the
des milieux
objects.
naturels et
So these are
conservés
very
donc
safe
pour avoir
endogenous
une bonne
methods,
qualité
effective and
de
chemical
milieu
free,
naturel.
so entirely
Moi,
with natural
je
products.
dirais oui, on avait des méthodes à nous
And that
pour
would really
conserver
allow us to
ces
have a
objets.
good quality of our goods,
Concernant les
cultural.
microcrédits,
So I think
je dis que
I would say
le
yes.
fonds de roulement
We had our own
est venu
methods for
par
keeping
une technique
objects.
qui a mis en place
With
la banque
regard to
mutuelle.
microloans, I'm saying that,
Et donc, après avoir, c'est lorsque
the working capital is given by the technical
vous
team
donnez
that
des
set up the
informations sur votre
cultural
objet,
bank, and
et
so
il y
after
a,
that
il y
is
a un
when,
comité qui est là, qui pour évaluer
you give
votre
yourself
objet.
information
Et
about
c'est
your
quoi la valeur
object.
esthétique?
And there is a committee
Là,
that
je
is there,
précise. C'est pas parce qu'un objet est beau, il est grand ou
who to
joli, vous allez
evaluate the
avoir
information that is given. And that's
on
not
appelle
the
ça un
aesthetic
vrai
value.
important.
I
C'est
specify,
l'information que
it's
vous donnez
not because
sur
an
l'objet.
object is
Donc,
beautiful. It's big that
c'est
you're going to
l'objet
have
qui est
an,
venu, qui
we
décide
call it
de
a bit
vous
important.
un prêt.
It's the
Donc,
information you're giving about the
est
object.
décidé par les membres de la
So it
communauté.
is this committee that meets
Donc,
and
si ce prêt
decides to grant a loan. As I said,
et il y a
everything is
mensualité
decided by
où
community
les
members.
activités génératrices de revenus sont
And so if this
consignées
loan is
pour permettre
granted,
aux communautés de ne pas dilapider l'argent
and there
reçu.
is the cultural
Donc,
center,
les
which is where
employages
income-generating
des
activities
activités
are taught,
génératrices de
to
revenus
enable
pour
communities
essayer
not to squander the money received.
de gagner des bénéfices sur le prêt qu'ils
So
ont
we encourage them to carry out
fait.
income-generating activities,
Donc, donc,
to
dans
try
les
to earn a
villages,
profit on the
les
loan they
statistiques
have
ont permis
done.
de voir que
And so,
les femmes
so
sont
in the village,
celles
our
qui tirent
statistics allowed us
mieux leur épingle
to see
du
that
jeu.
women are,
Et aussi, on
the
a vu
ones that
que
shoot,
lorsque on octroie des prêts aux femmes,
better
les
at their
femmes
game.
sont enclins à beaucoup aider leur famille que les hommes.
And also we
Et en
saw that
matière
when
de
we grant
paiement,
loans to
il a été
women,
constaté aussi que les femmes sont
these women are more likely to help their families than men and in
plus
material
vite
of payment.
que les hommes.
It was also found that women are
Ce qui fait
paying
que
faster than men.
les femmes sont de meilleures clientes que les hommes.
So what makes
La
us see
politique
that
culturelle est-elle plus au sérieux?
women are better customers than
Très
men?
important
Cultural
parce que
policy,
dans des pays
is
où
it taken seriously?
les valeurs culturelles sont très importantes et sont très diverses, je pense
A very important
quand même il y a
question,
mieux à
because in
faire.
countries
Il y a
where
mieux à faire pour que
cultural values are
votre
very
culture soit
important and
mieux mise
very
en valeur
diverse,
et que notre
I
culture
still think there are
soit
better
mieux mise
things
en
to
avant.
do. There
Parce
are
que
better
ce qu'il
things to
faut
do
faire
so
et
that
une chose est claire, c'est que tout développement
cultural heritage be better valued and that cultural heritage be better promoted. Because one thing is clear, it is that all development is based on a cultural foundation, and if that's true, I think it's time we went back and agreed. Much more importance to culture and cultural heritage so that we are something. Start very present. See you tomorrow.
La suite des questions.
Thank you.
À la question de
Thanks.
savoir,
I will continue
est-ce que les
immediately.
objets rituels ont leur place
The
en
rest of the
communauté? Je dirais de
questions.
manière péremptoire, non.
To the
Les
question of
objets
knowing,
rituels n'ont pas leur
do
place
ritual
dans ce que
objects
les
have a
symbolisent
place in
parce
museums?
que
I would say
j'ai
peremptorily
dit
no.
ici depuis que la
Cultural
collecte des objets
objects,
avait
ritual
la
objects have
participation
no
des
place in a
et tous
museum.
les objets qui
That's what
figurent
I've
sur
been
le
trying to tell him here
musée.
ever
Et
since.
s'il faut
Because
vraiment
I said
avoir
here
très
since the
comprendre
collecting of the
la
objects is
question des
done.
restitutions des biens culturels dont nous avons à présent,
With the participation of the chiefs, and not all objects and rituals enter the museum. And if it's still necessary, that, for example, I take the question of the return of cultural goods. So now we have, and it's currently ongoing in Cameroon. In the strategy of relationships between guys on site, There are several levels of feedback. The items will come in first at the National Museum, and after a Cameroonian or Cameroonian discussion, all ritual objects will return to their community. Was playing the role they were called upon to play. No ritual object enters a museum. Not all ritual objects have a place in the museum, and that's very clear. And these are the people said. It is that objects that still retain their use value. The rights remain in secret societies. I want to continue. There was a second question, like why communities? Why do the donor communities consider the museum to be the place of conservation? I tried to say it's just, nowadays, the museum is being taken over by traditional power, not the local government. The museum has also become a new urban development paradigm. And the museum has also become a new place for positioning communities. Communities are proud to drop off items, and because they are proud to have their own museum, and because all these museums, there is a real cultural tourism that will develop, and that's going to benefit the local population. It's not, for example, a city like, Fumban in Cameroon. What will be the city without its Museum of Kings? And that is the main attraction of this city. Communities are proud to bring their objects, and even if they do not only bring objects to museums, communities, and even at the National Museum, there is a whole project here to create the Unity Room, because culture is considered to be the glue that holds national unity together. We went to resource persons, community leaders, the data. How do you want your community to be presented at the National Museum? And some communities have brought the most symbolic objects quite voluntarily. The objects that are affirming more and more, that truly affirm identity, because these are the objects that mark our identity. We would like these objects to remain in the museum to better represent us, and for communities to are sometimes proud to be represented at the National Museum. There was yet another question that had been asked, whether there were no endogenous structures for the conservation of objects. And every time we go to a country like Germany, for example, we ask, are you able to keep the items that are returned? The question I'm asking them is, when these objects, was it in a poor state of conservation? No, because in Africa there were several endogenous conservation methods. Collections that are in fact that all the objects that were taken to Europe were in, as I would say, most of them in a very good state of conservation, and even these Western museums, thanks to the classical conservation, who will dig up the objects, and what will ensure that some objects that return to Africa are even factories of gas because of all the chemicals that were used around these objects. For there are indeed endogenous structures for the conservation of collections. Before the museums opened, there is even one of the first museums in sub-Saharan Africa in 1922, long before the birth of the Bamount King's Museum. There were many structures that were still guarding, even nowadays, endogenous conservation techniques for collections. There is also a question from Olivier Swahili, namely, do you believe that there is a cultural and sub-Saharan policy? Has it been taken seriously? If I take for example Cameroon, my country in question, it must be said that, before, there was a whole pattern. There was a plan for the economic development of the country, what we call as soon as the culture was logical in the social sphere. And since 2020, a new economic development strategy has been put in place, what is called SNB 30 or LA. The culture here has changed no particular place, and it is said in the SNB 2030 that culture is migrating from the social to the goods and services industry, and that even at the state level, the vision of culture is changing. Nowadays, culture is increasingly being asked to produce wealth and statistics. The culture. This is why, at the level of the Ministry of Culture, a real strategy for cultural events has been established through the structuring of the artistic and cultural movement. The structuring of the artistic and cultural movement is intended to be an artistic organization on the horizontal and vertical planes. What will give power? Which will give artists the opportunity to create wealth? You have to say, even though it's tending to develop, public authorities are increasingly taking into account, the role of politics. This is why institutions are increasingly prominent in all projects of development, and even at any time. We always wonder what the place is, what is the contribution, what is the, how should I say, what is the contribution of politics to GDP? If that hadn't been that before in the strategy, in the development strategy, things are changing, or culture is playing a real role as a driver of economic development. Thank you. We continue with questions from the public. We're going to take two. Hoping to be in time. If time allows us, before concluding, a first question. Let's say a question from the audience. We are from Arthur Alacher. It's I don't know if I'm reading well. To address the question to Professor Keita Dauda. Professor Arthur wants to know, The object is therefore a guarantee under the cultural bank, a guarantee for the loan. But what happens in case of non-payment? That's the teacher's question. Doubt the question comes to us from one. Of someone. From anonymous, who asks, given the enthusiasm of the community for regional museums, what is the role of the National Museum of Cameroon in relation to all these initiatives? Would you mind answering these two questions before we ask others? If time permits. Okay. Thank you so much. In fact, everything is done to ensure that there is no non-payment. If there are cases of attempted non-payment, we contact the committee of wise men who can act in some way on the one who has to the person in debt to pay, but also the objective. The objective, no. We call that the principle of the cultural banks. It is to be the place for the conservation of objects. Because we realize if the objects are in the families, not everyone can come in families to see these items. Whereas if the object is in a village museum, so the door is open for everyone. In fact, the objective is to keep the objects in the cultural bank as long as possible. So, we don't want that. There's a non-payment. But as long as we don't pay, you cannot take back your item. There it is. That's it. But frankly, we don't want that to happen because the object, if it is in cultural hands, if there is no contact with its owner, he is not alive. While an of is a strong concept in cultural banking, is that the object becomes a living object. Yes, well, we understand that we don't want that to happen, but, and if that happens, I think that's Ben's question. If that happens, the object stays in the cultural bank, and what does the object become? Well, the object becomes an object of the community that is in the cultural bank because the cultural bank has no object. Well, I think maybe it's a question that we can go deeper into. After that, because it raises a lot of questions, I think. And precisely because there is another question that goes in this direction, which poses legal problems. That is to say, how is the principle of the inalienability of objects? Museum applies to the bank, right? When you know that objects belong to their owner and not to the institution. Who is the cultural bank? So I think it's really a question that involves a lot of others questions, including legal issues. Yes, but the owner of the object in the community. And thanks the object does not leave the community. The object is in its usual context. He does not leave. So I think that these questions can be resolved locally because hence the Committee of Wise Men. The Committee of Wise Men brings together the elders of the locality and who have traditional methods to try to solve problems that may arise. That's it. This is because we wanted to work on local concepts for managing cultural heritage based on principles. There you go, communities to be able to manage this. Thank you, Professor Dauda. Professor, do you have the floor, please? Thank you. The question who, but thank you. The question I was asked earlier is about the fact that regional museums are so popular. Doesn't that bother the National Museum? It must be said that I tried to talk earlier about the structuring of the cultural fabric in Cameroon. In Cameroon, which is intended to be a horizontal and vertical structure. This horizontal plane, there are the National Museum and the regional museums. It doesn't bother you at all. The National Museum. Why? Because it contributes. What was called in Cameroon the construction of heritage routes. What does that mean? Cultural diversity? What is it? It is the contribution of all cultures to the building of national cultures. What does that mean? Even at the level. At the regional level, each museum, each committee has its own museum and, at the national level, a national culture. It is. And it contributes more to developing the democratization of access to culture. We are very open and, moreover, we encourage the creation of regional museums with which we will work in synergy and complementarity to be able to create heritage itineraries. Not only heritage itineraries and even artistic and cultural circulation. It is completely normal. It is we are very open, very happy with the creation of regional museums.
On ne vous attend pas.
Donc, excusez-moi, je disais que
They're not waiting for us. So, excuse me. I was saying that, the time that we have left, it's one of the very last questions. It is. First addressed mainly to professors who are at the same time director, generals, let's say museum director. The question comes to us from the audience. What are the means set up by the government of your respective countries in order to preserve the cultural values of the territories? How the cultural transition with the changes and evolution of society adapts? And her? I think that will be the last question before the final note. The change. Cultural change in the territories. It must be said that within Cameroon, Cameroon has just really started decentralization through the creation of regional councils, and then the mayors of the cities and through the competences transferred. A large part of the initiatives are devolved to the presidents of the regional councils, who have the possibility of creating museographic institutions, cultural institutions, and things are trying to work out. It is true that funding does not follow directly, but there is in a kind of interterritorial competition. There are a lot of, nowadays there are, more and more cultural projects, museographic projects that develop in communities, that are growing in the territories and even in demand. Demand is becoming more and more strong. We actually saw, I'm taking the example of a museum, for example, the local art museum in Marrakesh, where the mayor of the city wrote who wants this museum handed over to him to manage. So that means there are some communities that openly ask that they be returned. Some public museums or management. That means there's a total craze, at the population level. It is the real element that goes into the creation of festivals. Each community, each village is going to have its festival, which is one. Who is one, which is a strategic positioning space, even of political positioning and also within communities, so to speak. That, at the committee level, things are really moving. Everyone wants to create their own museum. Everyone wants to create their own festival and everyone tries to raise funds in their own way. Whether at the national level, only at the level of cooperation and at the construction at the level of international cooperation, decentralized and even at the elite level. There is a real cultural craze in the country. With and sometimes without the state. What you need to know sometimes. Some go directly internationally to raise funds without the state. But, we are happy to have you all, in this panel. I thank our three panelists for their presence and the various interventions that gave us a lot of information. Thank you very much. Thank you. On behalf of the organization and so, that's where we're going to close this panel and so, I allow myself, at the request of the organization, to inform you that it will be held on the 25th of this month in run a seminar whose sheet is here balancer on screen. And so we invite you to participate as massively as possible at this session. Well, for today, thank you all. We thank the audience who asked a lot of questions. We were not able to take all the questions and so this shows the interest that, you have all and all of you, for this panel. Thank you so much.
à la prochaine.
Be thanked and so we are going to say too. See you again and see you next time.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Goodbye, goodbye. 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 Thank you.